Blood is thicker than water, but greed can freeze a family solid. At 78 years old, Silas and Martha Pendleton found themselves standing on a freezing Chicago pavement, a single trash bag holding 50 years of memories. Their own flesh and blood, their only son, had swindled them out of their pension, sold their family home, and left them to die in the brutal winter. But destiny has a ruthless way of repaying the broken-hearted. Driven into the snowy wilderness by a desperate inheritance, they thought they were walking into a frozen grave. They had no idea that the blizzard-battered mountain mansion waiting for them hid a secret in its attic, a rusted iron safe holding $265 million. The house on Elm Street in Evanston, Illinois, smelled of cinnamon, old paper, and a half-century of quiet, enduring love. Silas Pendleton, a retired machinist with hands scarred by decades of honest labor, sat in his worn leather recliner. Across the room, his wife, Martha, a former elementary school teacher, hummed softly as she knitted a scarf. They were 78 years old, living on a modest pension and Social Security, but they owned their home outright. It was their sanctuary, the place where they had raised their only son, Paul. Paul was the center of their universe. They had sacrificed everything to put him through business school, remortgaging the house twice to ensure he could walk across the stage at Northwestern University without a dime of debt. Now, Paul was a successful corporate liquidator, driving a sleek black Mercedes and wearing suits that cost more than Silas's first car. He was married to Caroline, a woman whose sharp features were matched only by her razor-thin patience for anyone she deemed beneath her tax bracket. It started on a Tuesday in early November. Paul and Caroline arrived unannounced, carrying a thick manila folder. Paul's face was masked in a look of deep, performative concern. "Dad, Mom, we need to talk about your future," Paul said, refusing the tea Martha offered. He slapped the folder onto the oak coffee table. "The economy is taking a nosedive. Inflation is eating your pension alive. Caroline and I have been talking to our wealth manager, and we've found a loophole to protect your assets from the state if you ever need long-term care." Silas adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, squinting at the dense legal jargon. "Protect it? From what, Ricky? We do just fine. The house is paid for." "That's exactly the problem," Caroline chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. She crossed her legs, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "If either of you falls ill, Medicare will drain your savings and take this house. Paul is offering to put the deed into a protective trust under his name. He will manage the property, pay your taxes, and ensure you have a stipend for the rest of your lives. It's an estate planning maneuver. Everyone in our circle is doing it." Martha looked at Silas, her eyes filled with unwavering trust in the boy she had carried. "Ricky, you're sure this is safe? This house? It's all we have left to leave you and the grandchildren." "Mom, I'm doing this for the grandchildren." Paul lied smoothly, not missing a beat. "Just sign on the highlighted tabs. I'll take care of the rest." Trusting their son implicitly, Silas and Martha signed the documents. They didn't know they weren't signing a protective trust. They were signing over the absolute deed to the property and giving Paul a sweeping power of attorney over their finances. 3 weeks later, the facade shattered. A loud pounding on the door shattered their quiet morning. It wasn't Paul. It was a pair of men in cheap suits carrying clipboards, flanked by a local sheriff's deputy. "Silas Pendleton?" the older man asked, holding up a clipboard. "We're from the property management firm. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. The new owners want to begin renovations on Monday." Silas's heart slammed against his ribs. "New owners? There's a mistake. I own this house." "Not according to the county clerk, sir. The property was sold to a real estate developer 2 weeks ago by a Mr. Paul Pendleton." Panic, cold and suffocating, washed over Silas. He scrambled for the rotary phone in the kitchen, his trembling fingers dialing Paul's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried Caroline's cell phone. Blocked. He called Paul's office, only to be told by a frosty secretary that Mr. Pendleton was on a 3-week vacation in the Maldives and was not to be disturbed. The reality hit them like a physical blow. Their bank accounts, which Silas checked at the local branch later that afternoon, had been drained to the legal minimum. The power of attorney had been weaponized. They were destitute. With nowhere to go, a social worker temporarily placed them in Sunset Pines, a dilapidated, severely underfunded state-run assisted living facility on the outskirts of Chicago. It smelled heavily of ammonia and despair. For 2 months, Silas and Martha existed in a tiny, gray room, sharing a single twin bed. They wept quietly in the dark, mourning not just the loss of their home, but the death of the son they thought they knew. But the cruelty wasn't finished. In late January, the facility administrator called Silas into a cramped office. "Mr. Pendleton, the private supplementary funds your son, agreed to pay for your placement here, have bounced. We cannot keep you on the state minimums alone. I'm sorry, but we need the bed." They were evicted. Again. On a bitterly cold afternoon, with snow whipping through the air, Silas and Martha found themselves standing on the curb. Martha clutched a black plastic trash bag containing 3 changes of clothes, a photo album, and her knitting needles. Silas wrapped his arm around her frail shoulders, his own coat threadbare against the biting wind. They had $32 to their name. The Starlight Motel was a rotting structure off Interstate 90, a place where neon lights flickered and died, much like the hopes of the people who stayed there. Silas had managed to secure a room for 2 nights by offering the night manager his gold wedding band as collateral, a sacrifice that had made Martha sob until she couldn't breathe. The room was freezing. The radiator hissed but produced no heat. Silas sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, coughing a deep, rattling cough that terrified Martha. She sat beside him, rubbing his back, wrapping him in the single, scratchy wool blanket the motel provided. "We'll figure this out, Artie," Martha whispered, though her voice shook. "We'll go to the police tomorrow. We'll tell them what Paul did." "We signed the papers, Martha," Silas replied, his voice hollow, stripped of its usual warmth. "I read the fine print at the legal aid office yesterday. He did it legally. Immoral, evil, but legal. We gave him the keys to our destruction." Just as despair threatened to swallow them whole, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed on the flimsy motel door. Silas stiffened. Had the manager come to kick them out early? Silas opened the door a crack. Standing in the freezing rain was a man in his late 50s, wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat and a fedora that shielded his face from the sleet. He looked entirely out of place in the grimy corridor. "Silas Pendleton?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the wind. "Who's asking?" Silas replied defensively. "My name is Harrison Sterling. I am a senior partner at Sterling, Croft & Associates, a law firm based out of Denver. I have been looking for you for nearly a month, Mr. Pendleton. Your son was exceptionally unhelpful in providing your whereabouts." Silas opened the door wider, letting the lawyer step into the dim, freezing room. Sterling took off his hat, his eyes scanning the deplorable conditions with a flash of genuine pity before returning to a professional stoicism. He opened a sleek leather briefcase and withdrew a sealed, heavy parchment envelope. "I am here regarding the estate of your older brother, Silas Pendleton," Sterling said. Silas froze. Silas. He hadn't heard that name in over 40 years. Silas was 5 years older. A wild, unpredictable man who had left Chicago in the 1970s after a bitter, explosive argument with their father over the family business. Silas had walked out the door, vowing never to return, and he had kept his promise. Rumors over the decades suggested Silas had become a crazy mountain recluse, a gold prospector who had lost his mind in the Rockies. "Silas," Silas breathed. "Is he? He passed away 6 weeks ago, Mr. Pendleton." "He was 83, Sterling said softly. "I am sorry for your loss. I was his personal attorney." Silas slumped back onto the bed. He felt a pang of sorrow, a distant grief for a brother he barely remembered. "I don't understand why you're here. Silas and I haven't spoken since the Nixon administration. Be that as it may, Silas never married and had no children. Despite his eccentricities and your prolonged estrangement, he kept tabs on you. He knew about Paul. He knew about your life. And in his last will and testament, he named you his sole beneficiary." Martha gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Beneficiary? Did Silas have any money?" Sterling sighed, a complicated expression crossing his face. "Your brother was a complicated man. He distrusted banks, the government, and society in general. On paper, his liquid assets are negligible. A few $100s in a local checking account. However, he did own a piece of real estate outright, a property known as Blackwood Manor, located in a remote, unincorporated section of the San Juan Mountains in Colorado, about 50 miles outside of Telluride. "A house?" Silas asked, a glimmer of desperate hope igniting in his chest. "We could sell it?" "Eventually, yes," Sterling cautioned. "But there are complications. The property is entirely off the grid and hasn't been assessed in decades. Furthermore, Silas stipulated in his will that the deed will only transfer to you after you have physically resided in the house for a period of 30 days. He was a paranoid man, Mr. Pendleton. He believed you needed to understand the mountain before you earned his legacy. If you do not claim the house and stay there, it reverts to the state." Silas looked at Martha. They were homeless. They were freezing. They had nothing left to lose. "How do we get there?" Silas asked. Sterling reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Silas anticipated you might need travel funds. He left a cash retainer with me for this exact purpose." He handed Silas $2,000 in crisp, new bills. "This will cover a train ticket to Denver, a rental vehicle capable of handling the mountain roads and basic supplies. But I must warn you, Mr. Pendleton, Blackwood Manor is extremely isolated. The winter there is unforgiving. It is not a place for the faint of heart." "Mr. Sterling," Martha said, her voice suddenly finding a core of steel, "we have been thrown away by our own son. The cold of a mountain is nothing compared to the cold we've already felt. The journey was a blur of exhausting train rides and motion sickness. By the time they reached Denver, Silas's cough had worsened, but the cash Sterling provided allowed them to buy thick, insulated winter coats, heavy boots, and a trunk full of non-perishable groceries. They rented a rugged four-wheel drive Jeep Cherokee, the tires heavily chained for the brutal conditions ahead. They drove southwest into the heart of the Rockies. As they passed through Telluride, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The local gas station attendant, a grizzled man missing 2 front teeth, stared at them in disbelief when Silas asked for directions to the old Blackwood Road. "You folks heading up to Silas's place?" the attendant asked, wiping his oily hands on a rag. "In this weather?" The radio just issued a severe blizzard warning. "They're predicting 4 feet of snow by tomorrow morning. That road ain't been plowed since the Reagan administration. You get stuck up there, ain't nobody coming for you till the spring thaw." "We don't have a choice," Silas said simply, handing the man a $20 bill. The drive up the mountain was a white-knuckle nightmare. The road was barely more than a logging trail, winding precariously along sheer drop-offs that plummeted into snow-choked canyons. The Jeep's engine roared in protest as it clawed its way up the steep inclines, the tires slipping and sliding on the black ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. Martha sat rigid in the passenger seat, her eyes squeezed shut, praying silently. After 2 agonizing hours of climbing, the dense pine forest suddenly broke open, revealing a massive, terrifyingly beautiful structure. Blackwood Manor sat on a plateau overlooking the valley, a sprawling, 3-story Gothic monolith built from dark, rough-hewn stone. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress meant to withstand the end of the world. Turrets pierced the gray sky, and a massive wraparound porch was buried under snowdrifts. It was beautiful, imposing and utterly desolate. Silas parked the Jeep as close to the heavy oak front doors as he could manage. The wind howled like a wounded animal, biting through their new coats instantly as they stepped out. Using the heavy iron key Sterling had given them, Silas struggled with the rusted deadbolt. With a loud, echoing clack, it finally turned. They pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. The air inside the mansion was colder than the air outside. It was a damp, trapped, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep straight into their marrow. The foyer was massive, dominated by a grand, sweeping staircase that disappeared into the gloom of the second floor. Every piece of furniture in the cavernous living room was draped in heavy white dust covers, making the room look like a graveyard of ghosts. "Hello?" Martha called out, her voice swallowed by the sheer size of the house. There was no electricity. Silas had lived entirely off the grid. Silas clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight he had bought in Denver, sweeping the beam across the walls. He spotted a massive stone fireplace in the center of the living room, big enough for a man to stand inside. Next to it was a cord of dry, split firewood stacked meticulously against the wall. First things first, Silas shivered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "We need a fire." For the next few hours, survival instinct took over. They brought their meager supplies inside, locking the heavy oak doors behind them. Silas managed to get a roaring fire going, the dry wood catching quickly and casting dancing, orange shadows across the dusty room. They pulled 2 large armchairs close to the hearth, wrapping themselves in blankets they found in a cedar chest. As the sun went down, the blizzard struck with apocalyptic fury. The wind battered the stone walls, shaking the thick glass of the windows. The sound was deafening, a relentless roar that made the massive house groan and creak. Looking out the window, Silas saw that the snow was falling so thick and fast that the Jeep in the driveway was already completely buried. They were trapped, utterly, completely isolated from the rest of human civilization. If Silas's health failed, or if they ran out of food, they would die here, and no one would know until the snow melted months later. Martha opened a can of soup over the fire, heating it in a cast-iron pot she found in the sprawling, antiquated kitchen. They ate in silence, the warmth of the broth fighting back the chill. "He lived like this," Martha whispered, looking around the dark, cavernous room, "for 40 years, all alone." "Why, Silas? Why would a man choose this?" "I don't know," Silas replied, staring into the flames. Silas always was running from something. I just didn't realize how far he ran. That night, they slept huddled together in front of the fire, the sheer exhaustion of the last few months finally pulling them into a deep, dreamless sleep. They had no idea that above them, hidden in the labyrinthine darkness of the third-floor attic, sat an artifact that would not only explain Silas's paranoia but would change the Pendleton family forever. The cold was their enemy tonight, but tomorrow, the mountain would begin to reveal its secrets. Morning broke not with sunlight, but with a muted, oppressive gray that filtered through the heavy frost on the windows. The blizzard had not yielded. If anything, the wind shrieked with greater ferocity, piling snowdrifts halfway up the first-floor windows. Silas woke to the biting cold, the fire having dwindled to glowing embers. His chest ached, the deep cough returning as he forced himself up to throw 3 more logs onto the grate. Martha stirred, pulling the heavy wool blankets tighter around her shoulders. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice raspy. "We aren't going anywhere anytime soon," Silas admitted grimly, watching the snow lash against the glass. "But we have warmth. And we have food. Today, we figure out what Silas left us." After a breakfast of instant oatmeal prepared over the fire with melted snow, they began to explore Blackwood Manor. The sheer scale of the house was dizzying. Armed with the heavy-duty maglite Silas had purchased at a Denver hardware store, they moved through the first floor. It was a museum of a life halted in time. The furniture was heavy, Victorian oak and mahogany, much of it draped in dust covers. But it was the kitchen, and the adjoining pantry that first revealed the depth of Silas's eccentricities. Behind a heavy reinforced door, they found a survivalist's dream. Floor-to-ceiling metal shelving held hundreds of cans of military-grade MREs, meals, ready to eat, massive plastic drums of purified water, commercial first aid kits, and rows of sealed mason jars containing pickled vegetables. He was preparing for a war, Martha whispered, running a hand over a dusty box of iodine tablets. Or the end of the world, Silas noted. Look at the windows. Martha followed his gaze. Every ground floor window was fitted with custom-forged iron shutters on the inside, secured by heavy deadbolts. Silas hadn't just built a home, he had built a fortress. They moved to the second floor, their footsteps echoing on the grand staircase. The air grew noticeably colder up here. They found 3 guest bedrooms, completely bare and coated in a thick layer of dust, suggesting no one had visited Silas in decades. At the end of the long, shadowed hallway was the master bedroom. Inside, the room was sparse. A simple iron-framed bed, a wooden dresser, and a massive mahogany desk positioned in front of a bay window overlooking the treacherous valley. On the desk sat an old, heavy Underwood typewriter and a stack of leather-bound ledgers. Silas sat in his brother's chair, blowing the dust off the top ledger. The pages were filled with Silas's cramped, frantic handwriting. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. It was a paranoid manifesto mixed with financial calculations. The 14th of October 1998, one entry read, "The markets are fragile. The dot-com illusion will burst. Move the remaining liquid assets from the Caymans. Physical is the only truth. Paper is a promise that men will break. They are looking. I know they are looking." "Who was looking for him, Artie?" Martha asked, reading over his shoulder. "I don't know," Silas said, flipping through the pages. The entries spanned decades, tracking global financial crises, political shifts, and a deep-seated distrust of the banking system. But one entry from just 3 months ago, shortly before Silas died, caught Silas's eye. August 2nd. "The wolves are sniffing around the perimeter. I received a letter today, a private investigator out of Chicago. He was asking the local sheriff about land deeds in the San Juans. They think I'm just a crazy old prospector. They don't know about the iron box. They will never get the combination." The 18th of April, 2068. "The day the bridge burned. If I die, the state takes the land, but the box stays buried in the sky." Silas stared at the numbers. The 18th of April, 2068. "The day the bridge burned." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room ran down his spine. "Martha," Silas said, his voice trembling. "The 18th of April, 1968. That was the day Silas had the fight with our father. The day he packed his bags, burned his inheritance documents in the backyard fire pit, and walked away from the family forever." Martha's eyes widened. "The iron box, he means a safe. He says it's buried in the sky." Silas looked up at the ceiling. "He means the attic." Finding the entrance to the attic proved to be a puzzle in itself. The second-floor hallway ended in a blank wall adorned with peeling damask wallpaper. There were no pull-down stairs, no obvious doors. It took them an hour of tapping on walls and inspecting the woodwork before Silas found a nearly invisible seam in the oak wainscoting near the master bedroom. Pressing a hidden latch behind a sconce, the panel clicked and swung outward with a groan of protesting hinges, revealing a narrow, steep staircase winding upward into absolute darkness. The air drafting down from the stairwell was frigid, carrying the scent of dry rot and old metal. "Silas, you're shivering. Your cough is getting worse," Martha warned, grabbing his arm as he stepped onto the first riser. "Let's wait. Let the storm pass." "We can't wait, Martha. We have $30 to our name and a son who threw us to the wolves. If Silas left something up there that can save us, I need to know now." With Martha close behind, Silas climbed the steep stairs, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the oppressive gloom. The attic spanned the entire length of the massive house. The wind howled furiously against the roof, making the wooden rafters groan loudly. The space was filled with crates, antique furniture covered in tarps, and old mining equipment pickaxes, rusted gold pans, and headlamps. But sitting dead center in the room, resting on reinforced steel floor joists, was the prize. It was a Mosler safe, a relic from the early 20th century, weighing easily over 2,000 pounds. It was a block of solid, riveted iron, standing 4 feet tall, its surface pitted with rust and age. A heavy brass dial gleamed dully in the center of the heavy door, flanked by an imposing lever handle. Silas approached it slowly, his breath misting in the freezing air. He felt a profound sense of awe, mixed with an aching sadness. Silas had spent his entire life guarding this box, isolating himself from human connection, all for whatever lay behind this iron door. "Do you think the code from the journal is real?" Martha asked, her teeth chattering as she wrapped her coat tighter. "Only one way to find out," Silas replied. He handed Martha the flashlight and knelt before the cold iron. He wiped a layer of grime from the brass dial. He closed his eyes, remembering the entry. Arling Lubanyan Siye Shibari. He spun the dial to the right, clearing the tumblers. The clicks were loud and metallic in the quiet attic. He stopped on 4. He reversed direction, spinning left past the 4 once, stopping on 18. He reversed again, spinning right directly to 68. Silas grabbed the heavy lever handle. He took a deep breath, his lungs rattling, and pulled downward. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The handle felt fused to the metal. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the internal locking bolts snapped back. The massive iron door groaned heavily on its hinges and swung outward, revealing the dark interior. Martha brought the flashlight closer. The inside of the safe wasn't filled with stacks of cash or shiny gold bars, as one might expect from a movie. Instead, it was meticulously organized with fireproof lockboxes, thick manila envelopes, and velvet pouches. Silas pulled out the largest envelope first. It was heavy. He opened the clasp and slid the contents into his calloused hands. It was a stack of thick, ornate paper certificates. Silas squinted at the elaborate engraving. They were United States Treasury bearer bonds. "My God," Silas breathed. "I read about these in the legal aid office. They stopped issuing these in 1982. They belong to whoever physically holds them. There's no name attached. They're as good as cash." He checked the denomination on the top bond, $1 million. He thumbed through the stack. There were at least 50 of them in this envelope alone. Martha, shaking uncontrollably, opened one of the velvet pouches. She gasped, dropping it onto the wooden floor. Out tumbled a dozen pristine, 1-ounce South African Krugerrand gold coins, gleaming even in the dim flashlight beam. There were 10 more pouches just like it in the safe, but it was the small, leather-bound notebook sitting on the bottom shelf of the safe that froze the blood in Silas's veins. He picked it up and flipped it open. It was Silas's master ledger. It detailed exactly what was in the safe. $50 million in bearer bonds, $15 million in physical gold bullion, and the access codes to a series of numbered Swiss bank accounts holding roughly $200 million in diversified, high-yield global assets. Total estimated value, $265 million. Silas and Martha Pendleton, thrown onto the streets with a trash bag of clothes, were now unimaginably, staggeringly wealthy. But as Silas flipped to the final page of the ledger, a piece of folded paper fell out and fluttered to the floor. Martha picked it up and unfolded it. It was a printed email, intercepted or forwarded somehow by Silas's paranoid network. The email was dated October 12th, 3 weeks before Paul and Caroline had come to the Evanston house with the fake trust documents. Martha read the email aloud, her voice breaking. "To Paul Pendleton, REP, Arroba Apex Capital. End quote. From Thomas Callahan, Private Investigations Subject, The Colorado Asset, Silas Pendleton, Paul. I have confirmed your suspicions. Your uncle Silas is sitting on a massive fortune, entirely off the grid in the San Juan Mountains. He is in failing health and has not updated his will since 1990. Under the terms of that will, if he passes, everything goes to your father, Silas. Given the sheer scale of the untraceable assets, bonds, gold, if your father inherits, you will lose control of the capital due to your father's conservative financial habits. I strongly advise you to gain complete power of attorney over your father's estate immediately before Silas passes. If you control your father's assets when the inheritance hits, the $260M plus becomes yours to manage and liquidate as you see fit. The paper slipped from Martha's hands. The betrayal hit them with the force of a physical blow. Paul hadn't just stolen their house out of petty greed. He had known about Silas's fortune. He had orchestrated their eviction, drained their accounts, and left them to die in the cold specifically to ensure they would be powerless and under his legal thumb when the inheritance finally came through. He had treated them not as parents, but as a legal obstacle to a $250 million payday. Silas stared at the massive fortune inside the rusted iron safe. The grief that had weighed him down for months evaporated, replaced instantly by a blinding, white-hot fury. He thought we would die in that motel, Silas whispered, his voice completely devoid of its former frailty. He thought we would freeze, and he would sweep in as the grieving son to claim the mountain. Silas carefully placed the ledger and the bonds back into the safe. He looked at Martha, the firelight from downstairs reflecting in his eyes. "Martha," Silas said, his tone deadly calm, "we aren't going to be victims anymore." The revelation in the freezing, dust-choked attic of Blackwood Manor did not break Silas and Martha Pendleton. It should have. A normal couple, pushed to the brink of hypothermia and starvation, discovering that their only child had orchestrated their state-sanctioned execution for a pile of gold, might have simply laid down in the snow and let the sleep of the mountain take them. But as the wind screamed against the slate roof of the mansion, something inside Silas, a core of blue-collar steel forged in the machine shops of Illinois, snapped into place. They descended the narrow, treacherous attic stairs in a trance of adrenaline and fury. The grand foyer, which had felt like a tomb just hours before, now felt like a fortress. Martha's hands, though gnarled by age and the cold, no longer shook as she stoked the fire in the great room. The orange light danced off the walls, illuminating the portraits of stern, long-dead ancestors who seemed to watch them with newfound respect. "We have to survive 30 days, Silas whispered, his voice raspy but gaining a terrifying edge of command. He sat at the heavy oak table, the master ledger open before him. That is the game Silas wanted us to play. He knew Paul was a snake. He knew the boy would come for the mountain, and he built this house to be the trap that catches him. The first week was a brutal masterclass in primitive survival. The blizzard was relentless, a 100-year storm that buried the first floor in a tomb of white. They lived in the kitchen and the great room, the only spaces they could keep reasonably warm. Silas's cough, once a death rattle, began to subside. It was as if his body realized it no longer had the luxury of being ill. He spent his days in the basement, a sprawling labyrinth of reinforced concrete and Victorian machinery. There, he found the heart of Silas's paranoia. Silas hadn't just hoarded wealth, he had built a life support system. Silas discovered a massive bank of deep-cycle industrial batteries, a complex manifold for a geothermal heating system that drew warmth from the earth itself, and a professional-grade shortwave radio setup. But it was the discovery on the 10th day that changed the tide of their war. Behind a false wall in the pantry, Martha found a hidden cache of high-end technological equipment cases marked with the logos of defense contractors. Inside were encrypted satellite phones, a ruggedized laptop with a global uplink, and a series of legal folders that Silas had compiled over decades. Silas had been a ghost, a man who lived outside the system but kept his finger on its pulse. He had been tracking Paul for years. The folder labeled The Sun contained a meticulous record of Paul's corporate malfeasance, shell companies in Panama, offshore accounts used for money laundering, and the names of the corrupt officials he paid off to facilitate his liquidations. He knew, Martha said, her eyes scanning the documents by the light of a kerosene lamp. Silas knew what Paul was becoming. He was waiting for us to find this. He was waiting for us to wake up. Silas opened the ruggedized laptop. The battery was dead, but the geothermal generator he had painstakingly repaired hummed to life with a low, vibrating thrum that shook the floorboards. As the screen flickered to life, a password prompt appeared. "The day the bridge burned," Silas muttered. He typed in 04181968. The desktop loaded. It was a digital armory. Silas had set up automated triggers. If his death was reported to certain authorities, and a proof of life code wasn't entered by Silas within 45 days, the laptop would automatically leak Paul's financial crimes to the SEC and the FBI. "Silas gave us the gun," Silas said, looking at Martha, "but he left it to us to pull the trigger." On the 14th day, the satellite link finally established a connection. The outside world surged into the quiet, frozen mansion. Silas didn't call the police. He didn't call the family. He dialed a private number found in Silas's Rolodex, Harrison Sterling, a man whose name appeared on every legal document in the safe. "This is Harrison Sterling," a voice answered, sharp and professional. "Mr. Sterling, this is Silas Pendleton. I am speaking to you from Blackwood Manor." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Silas? My God. The news reports in Chicago. They said you were missing, presumed dead in a winter transit accident. Paul has already filed for a death certificate." "Paul is mistaken," Silas said, his voice cold and flat. "I am standing in my brother's house. I have opened the Mosler safe. I know about the bearer bonds. I know about the gold, and I know about the $200 million in the Swiss accounts. And most importantly, I know what my son has done." Sterling's tone shifted instantly. He wasn't just a lawyer. He had been Silas's only friend and his primary architect of shadows. "Silas, listen to me very carefully. If Paul has filed those papers, he is attempting to trigger a succession of necessity clause. He wants to claim the estate before you can prove you're alive. If he succeeds, he can legally liquidate the mountain before you ever step foot back in Illinois. What do I need to do? You need to stay put. You need to survive the full 30 days to satisfy the will's physical residency requirement. If you leave early, the deed becomes contestable. I am going to send a team, not the police, but a private security firm I trust. They will bring supplies, medical help, and a mobile notary. We are going to record every second of your residency. We are going to build a legal fortress around you that Paul can't touch." For the next 2 weeks, the war room was in full effect. The private security team, led by a taciturn man named Elias, arrived via a high-altitude helicopter that landed on the frozen plateau like a dragon from the mist. They brought heat, fresh food, and more importantly, information. Elias sat with Silas in the library, spreading out a map of Paul's financial empire. "Your son is over-leveraged, Mr. Pendleton. He didn't just want your house, he needed it. He's been using your assets as phantom collateral to secure massive loans for a hostile takeover of a logistics firm called Apex Global. He's gambling with money he hasn't even stolen yet." Martha joined them, her face set in a mask of grim determination. "He thinks we are dead. He thinks the mountain is his. Let him keep thinking that. How do we hit him where it hurts?" "We don't just hit him," Silas said, tapping the master ledger. "We dismantle him. Sterling, I want you to start buying. Every debt, every high-interest loan, every scrap of paper Paul has signed his name to. I want the Pendleton Trust to own it. I want to become my son's only creditor. The transformation of the couple was total. Martha, the retired schoolteacher, became a forensic accountant, working alongside Sterling's remote team to trace the $500,000 Paul had siphoned from their retirement accounts. Silas, the machinist, became the strategist, learning the nuances of the short squeeze and debt-for-equity swaps, the very weapons Paul had used to destroy other families. They spent their nights by the fire, but they no longer talked about the cinnamon-smelling house on Elm Street. They talked about exposure, liabilities, and total annihilation. The betrayal had been a poison, but the mountain had turned it into a medicine. By the 29th day, the snow began to melt, revealing the jagged, beautiful bones of the San Juan Mountains. The 30-day residency requirement was nearly complete. Silas stood on the wraparound porch, looking out at the vast, silent wilderness that Silas had called home. He understood now why his brother had lived here. In the silence of the peaks, there was no room for lies. There was only the wind, the stone, and the truth. "Are you ready, Artie?" Martha asked, stepping out onto the porch. She looked younger, her eyes bright with a dangerous vitality. "I've spent 50 years building things, Martha," Silas said, looking at his scarred hands. "I've built engines, I've built a home, and I thought I built a son. It turns out I'm much better at taking things apart." The helicopter returned the following morning. As it lifted off, the massive stone silhouette of Blackwood Manor shrinking below them, Silas clutched the briefcase containing the bearer bonds. He wasn't looking at the money. He was looking at a printed photograph of Paul, taken just a day ago in Chicago, showing his son smiling at a charity gala, champagne glass in hand, celebrating a fortune he thought was already in his pocket. The war room was moving. The mountain had finished its work. Now, it was time for the world to feel the cold. The transition from the frozen silence of Blackwood Manor to the gleaming glass and steel canyons of Denver was a sensory assault. But Silas and Martha Pendleton met it with eyes wide open. They sat in the back of a blacked-out SUV navigating the city streets, their hands clasped tightly together, not in fear, but in a unified, silent pact. They no longer resembled the frail, destitute couple who had been shoved out of a state-run facility with their lives shoved into a single trash bag. The brutal mountain air had lean-hardened Silas's frame, curing his terrifying cough and replacing it with a grim vitality. The discovery of their son's ultimate, sociopathic betrayal had burned the softness from Martha's gaze, leaving behind a fierce, maternal wrath. They were met at a private airfield by Harrison Sterling. The lawyer, draped in a bespoke Navy suit, was a man of impeccable tailoring and predatory instincts. He was the kind of man Silas Pendleton had trusted precisely because Sterling possessed a brilliant, calculating mind for high-stakes corporate warfare. The 30-day residency is verified, notarized, and filed under absolute seal with the Colorado Secretary of State, Sterling said as he ushered them into the private elevator of his downtown high-rise. "As of this morning, Silas, you are the undisputed legal owner of Blackwood Manor and every grain of dust within it. The bearer bonds have been authenticated, and the Swiss accounts are officially under your signature. You are, by any metric, one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest." Silas stared at the changing numbers on the elevator display. "Wealth is just a tool, Harrison. Today, it's a weapon. I want to know exactly how we use it." Sterling led them into his firm's secure conference center, a high-tech war room where 3 senior forensic analysts were already perched behind dual-monitor setups. The air hummed with the quiet intensity of a military command center. On the central wall, a massive digital projection displayed the complex, interconnected web of Paul Pendleton's financial empire. At the head of the table stood David Caldwell, a ruthless forensic accountant who had spent the last 2 weeks untangling Paul's life while Silas and Martha survived the blizzard. "Mr. and Mrs. Pendleton, it is an honor," Caldwell said, adjusting his glasses. He tapped a laser pointer against the screen, illuminating a central node labeled Apex Capital Holdings. Your son is a gambler. He has been playing a high-stakes, illegal game of financial kiting. He uses the inflated value of one asset to borrow against another, then uses those secondary loans to buy a third. It is a spectacular house of cards, and it only stays standing as long as no one pulls a single card from the bottom. Martha leaned in, her eyes tracing the glowing red lines connecting Paul's companies. And he used our house on Elm Street as one of those cards? Worse, Caldwell replied grimly. He used your house, your drained pension funds, and now he is attempting to use Silas's mountain. Caldwell pressed a button, and the screen shifted to display a breakdown of Paul's immediate liabilities. To fund a massive hostile takeover of a regional logistics firm, Paul took out a series of aggressive bridge loans totaling $42 million. He secured this capital from a shadow banking firm called the Obsidian Credit Syndicate. How did he get $42 million of credit? Silas asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Apex Capital isn't worth a fraction of that. He lied. Sterling interjected smoothly, taking a seat next to Silas. Paul told Obsidian Credit that he was the sole, uncontested heir to a $260 million estate in Colorado. He provided them with falsified preliminary probate documents, suggesting the inheritance was a guaranteed lock. He pledged Blackwood Manor and the hidden assets he paid a private investigator to uncover as his primary collateral. The sheer audacity of the crime hung heavily in the room. Paul had not only left his parents to die, he had actively monetized their presumed deaths before the snow had even settled on their coats. Silas looked at the staggering numbers on the screen. A month ago, a $30 diner bill would have broken him. Now, he was looking at a $42 million debt as if it were a rusted bolt he simply needed to unscrew. What happens to a man when his collateral suddenly ceases to exist? Silas asked. Sterling smiled, a sharp, lupine expression. When Obsidian Credit realizes the mountain belongs to a living, breathing Silas Pendleton, Paul's collateral evaporates instantly. Under the terms of his mezzanine debt, that triggers an immediate default of covenant. Obsidian will call in the $42 million in full within 24 hours. When Paul can't pay, they will seize everything he owns, his firm, his cars, his bank accounts. He will be utterly annihilated. No, Martha said, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. Sterling and Caldwell paused, looking at the elderly woman in surprise. Obsidian Credit didn't raise my son, Martha said, standing up and walking closer to the glowing screen. She pointed directly at Paul's name. Obsidian Credit didn't sit at my dining room table, drink my tea, and hand me fake trust documents. They don't get to be the ones who destroy him. We do. Silas stood up beside his wife, slipping his arm around her waist. Martha is right. If Obsidian ruins him, he's just another bankrupt businessman. We need him to know exactly whose hand pulled the lever. Silas turned to Sterling. You said the bearer bonds in the safe are as good as cash, entirely untraceable until they are deposited, correct? Yes, Sterling nodded. We have $50 million in verified United States Treasury bearer bonds sitting in a reinforced vault 2 floors down. Good, Silas said, his eyes locking onto the lawyers. I want you to form a blind, anonymous holding company. Call it Ironclad Holdings, LLC. I want you to take those bonds, contact Obsidian Credit Syndicate, and buy Paul's debt. Pay them a premium if you have to. I don't care about the cost. I want Ironclad to own every single penny my son owes. Caldwell's eyes widened behind his glasses. You want to become your son's sole creditor, Mr. Pendleton? If you own the debt, you hold the power to foreclose on his entire life. That is exactly the point, Silas stated coldly. To ensure total, inescapable destruction, Sterling and Caldwell drafted a multi-pronged offensive that would trap Paul legally, financially, and criminally. They laid out the strategy clearly on the boardroom table. The timing is the most critical element, Sterling cautioned, tapping his pen against the mahogany table. Paul has scheduled his probate hearing in Cook County for this coming Tuesday. He plans to stand before a judge, swear under oath that you perished in the wilderness, and demand the immediate release of Silas's assets. Let him, Martha said, her tone devoid of any remaining maternal warmth. Let him put his lies on the permanent record. Let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly can. Once he commits perjury, Sterling continued, I will reveal the revocation of his power of attorney, submit Silas's true will, and prove your residency. At that exact moment, Ironclad Holdings will electronically file the default notices. His collateral will vanish, his debt will be called in, and the forensic audit will be handed directly to the Illinois State's attorney. Silas took a deep breath, looking at the intricate web of his son's deceit. For a brief, fleeting second, the ghost of the father he used to be mourned the boy he had raised, but then he remembered the agonizing cold of the Starlight Motel. He remembered Martha sobbing as she handed over her gold wedding band just to keep them from freezing on the pavement. The father was dead. Only the liquidator remained. Draft the papers, Harrison, Silas commanded. Transfer the bonds. Buy the debt. We are going back to Chicago, and we are going to take our house back. The Paul J. Daly Center in downtown Chicago is a towering monument of glass and steel, housing courtrooms where the final bitter chapters of human lives are legally bound and sealed. On the morning of May 14th, courtroom 1704 was stiflingly warm. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Peterson, a magistrate with 30 years on the bench and a well-known zero-tolerance policy for probate fraud, presided over the docket. Sitting at the plaintiff's table was Paul Pendleton. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people made in a month, exuding a carefully curated aura of tragic, wealthy mourning. In the gallery directly behind him sat his wife, Caroline, casually adjusting a diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. She was already scrolling through her phone, communicating with a luxury real estate broker about a summer property in the Hamptons she intended to purchase the moment the gavel fell. Case number 2024PR08914, the bailiff called out, his voice echoing against the heavy oak paneling. The estate of Silas Pendleton, Paul Pendleton petitioning for executor status and a declaration of presumptive death for Silas and Martha Pendleton. Paul's attorney, a slick corporate litigator named Thomas Vance, no Vance allowed, named William Bradley, stood up and buttoned his jacket. Ready, Your Honor. Judge Peterson peered over her reading glasses, a massive stack of filings sitting before her. Mr. Pendleton, you are petitioning this court to declare your parents legally deceased under the succession of necessity statutes. This is an extreme measure. You are testifying that they vanished in the Colorado wilderness over 3 months ago? Paul stood, adopting an expression of profound, manufactured grief. He placed his hand on the wooden partition. Yes, Your Honor, my parents. They were suffering from severe cognitive decline. I placed them in a specialized care facility, but they wandered off. They took a train to Colorado to find my late uncle's off-the-grid property in the middle of a catastrophic blizzard. The local sheriff's department in San Miguel County called off the search weeks ago. It is a tragedy that has broken my family. And as a result, Judge Peterson continued, consulting the paperwork, you are claiming that you are the sole surviving heir to the estate of Silas Pendleton, which includes the property known as Blackwood Manor and all its associated uncatalogued assets? I am simply trying to secure my uncle's legacy and bring closure to my family. Paul lied smoothly, his voice cracking with perfect, practiced emotion. I see, Judge Peterson said. She raised her gavel, prepared to grant the motion that would hand Paul legal control over $250 million and solidify his monstrous betrayal forever. Before the wood could strike the sounding block, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, reverberating crack. The gallery fell deathly silent. Walking down the center aisle, their footsteps steady and synchronized on the polished marble floor, were Silas and Martha Pendleton. They did not look like the destitute, broken, freezing seniors Paul had kicked out of the state facility. The brutal winter of the San Juan Mountains had stripped away their frailty, replacing it with an undeniable, terrifying authority. Silas wore a perfectly tailored, midnight blue suit, his posture straight, his eyes locked onto his son like the barrel of a loaded gun. Martha walked beside him in a striking, elegant navy dress, a string of authentic South Sea pearls resting against her collarbone. They were flanked by Harrison Sterling, who carried a thick leather briefcase, and two heavily armed off-duty tactical officers acting as private security. Paul's face, drained of all color, transitioning rapidly from an expensive tan to the sickly white of a corpse. He fell back into his chair as if he had been physically struck, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Caroline dropped her phone. It shattered on the floor, unnoticed, her jaw unhinged in sheer, unadulterated terror. Silas walked past his son without so much as a glance, stepping directly up to the partition to face the bench. "Good morning, Your Honor. I am Silas Pendleton. This is my wife, Martha. We apologize for the interruption, but as you can plainly see, reports of our demise have been greatly exaggerated." "Objection," William Bradley stammered, completely blindsided, jumping to his feet. "Your Honor, I don't know what kind of stunt this is, but my client holds a durable, irrevocable power of attorney over his parents' estate. Revoked." Harrison Sterling's voice boomed, cutting through the lawyer's panic. Sterling stepped forward, slamming a thick, heavily stamped, notarized dossier onto the defendant's table. "Revoked months ago, Counselor. Furthermore, Your Honor, we are submitting to the court the verified last will and testament of Silas Pendleton, alongside an affidavit of residency certified by the Colorado Secretary of State." Judge Peterson, her eyes wide with shock, accepted the documents from the bailiff. She scanned the pages, her expression hardening into absolute judicial fury as she realized the depth of the perjury that had just occurred in her courtroom. The 30-day residency clause stipulated by Silas Pendleton has been fulfilled, Sterling announced to the silent room. The estate, including the property of Blackwood Manor, $50 million in United States Treasury bearer bonds, physical gold bullion, and a series of international accounts totaling approximately $265 million, belongs entirely, absolutely, and irrevocably to Silas Pendleton. Paul stood up, his hands shaking violently, his voice a high-pitched whine of panic. "You can't do this. That money is mine. I need that collateral. I already pledged the estate to Obsidian." "Ah, yes," Silas said, finally turning to look at the man he had raised. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet to match the sub-zero chill of the mountain they had just conquered. "The $42 million in mezzanine bridge loans you took out for Apex Capital. You needed our deaths to finalize the hostile takeover of Intercontinental Logistics." Paul gasped, his eyes wide, looking like a cornered animal. "How do you know about that?" "Because, Paul," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, devastating timbre that echoed off the courtroom walls. "We bought your debt." The realization hit Paul like a freight train slamming into a brick wall. He hadn't just lost the $250 million inheritance. The collateral he had used to secure his massive corporate loans had just evaporated into thin air. As the primary, exclusive debt holders of Apex Capital Holdings, Sterling addressed the court, withdrawing a second set of documents. Ironclad Holdings, LLC, a private trust entirely controlled by Silas and Martha Pendleton, is immediately calling in the $42 million loans due to breach of covenant, fraudulent misrepresentation of collateral, and perjury. Sterling handed a single sheet of paper directly to Paul's trembling lawyer. "Notice of default. Since your client cannot produce $42 million in liquid cash today, we are executing an immediate foreclosure on all of Mr. Pendleton's corporate and personal assets. This includes his investment firm, his vehicles, his offshore accounts, and his primary residence." "No, no, no!" Caroline shrieked from the gallery, standing up, tears ruining her designer makeup. "Paul, do something! We can't lose the house!" "Oh, it gets worse, Mrs. Pendleton," Sterling added mercilessly, turning to face the gallery. "We have also forwarded a comprehensive forensic audit, conducted by David Caldwell of Denver, to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and the Illinois State's Attorney's Office. It meticulously details the forged signatures Paul used to illegally transfer the deed of the Evanston property, the subsequent wire fraud, and the intentional, documented elder abuse. Criminal warrants for your husband's arrest are currently being drafted." Paul fell to his knees, right there on the floor of the Cook County Probate Court. The facade of the untouchable corporate raider shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He looked up at his father, tears streaming down his face, his voice breaking into the terrified sobs of a child who realizes he has pushed too far. "Dad, Mom, please," Paul begged, crawling an inch forward. "I'm your son. I'm your Ricky. Please don't do this. I'll lose everything. They'll put me in federal prison. We're family." Silas looked down at his son. He remembered the boy he had taught to ride a bicycle. He remembered the college tuition he had paid for with his own sweat and blood. But overriding those memories was the biting, agonizing cold of the Starlight Motel. He remembered Martha sobbing as she handed over her wedding ring just to keep them from freezing on the pavement. He remembered the trash bag. The father Paul had known was dead. Only the liquidator remained. "You made your choice about family, Paul, on the day you handed us a trash bag and sent us out into the snow," Silas said softly, his voice devoid of any pity. "We are simply closing the account." Silas turned back to the judge. "We withdraw our petition to contest, Your Honor. The defense rests." Silas took Martha's hand. Together, without looking back at the wailing, ruined man on the floor, they walked out of the courtroom, out through the heavy oak doors, and into the bright, warm Chicago sunlight, leaving the ghosts of their past locked in the dark forever. The tragedy of the Pendleton family stands as a chilling modern testament to the corrupting, absolute power of greed and the indomitable strength of human survival. Paul's relentless pursuit of wealth blinded him to the foundational bonds of family, transforming him into the architect of his own spectacular, inescapable ruin. He believed his parents were weak, disposable assets to be liquidated. Instead, they became the unyielding force that held him accountable to the law and to morality. In the end, the $265 million fortune was not merely an inheritance, but an instrument of poetic, surgical justice. Silas and Martha reclaimed their stolen Evanston home, converting the massive, fortified structure of Blackwood Manor into a heavily funded, secure sanctuary and legal advocacy center for victims of elder financial abuse. They proved that while the winter of betrayal is brutally cold, the fires of survival and righteous justice burn hot enough to melt even the most ruthless of empires.